back. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here this morning. We're talking about the Bundy Ranch and the federal standoff going on out there. For those of you that are just joining us, it is a tragedy in the making and a crisis, a constitutional crisis, quite frankly. We've got a Bureau of Land Management and a National Park Service that have taken it upon themselves to attempt to enforce a court order, which, quite frankly, has its own nebulous questionability. You know, the issue here is, and with all due respect, I hear people say, well, there's a court order. I understand that. But I got to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Jefferson made it very clear that the courts are not the final arbiters of you, your constitutional rights, or the Constitution itself. You know, the Nazis had courts. The Soviet Union had courts that sent literally millions of Russians to gulags. The Italian fascists during the time of Mussolini had courts. Venezuela has courts. And yet, if you're going to give credence to the courts, you have to recognize that their power and authority only exists when the courts and the government itself are operating in a manner where justice is sought. With all due respect, that is not the case here today. And it hasn't been the case in the United States of America for a very long time. What we have is administrative agencies where you go before an administrative law judge. You do not have a right to a trial by jury. You have a right to be heard before an administrative law judge who, quite frankly, represents the agency that you're in contention with. Anyone would construe that to be a conflict of interest. Bundy is not the only rancher to have taken on the federal government in this way. I saw an expose or a special the other day about another family that's been in the same fight over the same exact issue, by the way, for literally 30 years. The problem here is that the Bureau of Land Management has given itself authority. It is self-appointed. Recognize that in order for the Bureau of Land Management to give itself authority, merely all it needs to do is create a rule and a regulation and then post it in the Federal Register. That's it. There's no oversight. There's no review. There's generally a public comment period. But these public comment periods are, for all intents and purposes, a sham. Number one, you're generally prohibited from seeing what the public comments were. So it's up to them to interpret the public comments they've received and then make a determination as to whether or not they want to adhere to those public comments. More often than not, the public comment period is also interspersed with an enormous amount of lobbying activity where professional lobbyists who are paid for whatever special interest is being served by this particular rule and regulation go in there and they work with Congress or they work with the representative who is in charge of that given, who's the representative for that given area or zone or whatever the park is or whatever the rulemaking is about. And these lobbyists, they control and rule the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is not something where the general public is ever really given any credence. Their wishes are never given credibility. I can speak to that on a personal level, where we have been putting in public notice to the National Park Service in the Ozark Scenic Riverways. They attempted actually to utilize a tactic where all of the comments had to be submitted electronically so that they could be reviewed and chosen. And the way that, just to give you an example of how corrupted the process is, they actually had the nerve to say that if five public comments from concerned people came in And they were all talking about the same thing. In other words, in the national parks, or in the Ozark Scenic Riverways area here, they were, let's say that 5 articles came in and said, we don't think you should restrict canoes. That they would consider that to be one response because all 5 of them dealt with canoes. You cannot be more corrupt than that. Meanwhile, lobbyists are plying them with money, plying them with promises of special favors down the road. The BLM, at this point, has made a couple of statements. First of all, there are about 900 and some odd cattle that belong to Bundy. And the BLM claims that they've been trespassing without required grazing permits for over 25 years. Well, that's not exactly true. BLM rescinded his permits. And first of all, he's been doing this since the 1870s. So the fact that he's even obtaining a permit, see, this goes to the heart of the issue of where you never want to have government issue a license or a permit. Because once they give that to you, they are in control of you and your destiny forevermore. What government gives to you, they can take away from you. That's why this issue with Chuck hits the fan Schumer, when the Schumer hits the fan, with the issue surrounding the licensing of journalists, is completely and totally unacceptable. Our free speech is not limited to who the government licenses, nor is your free speech limited to limiting a protester to a fenced-in area in the desert in Nevada where you are told if you step out of that area and protest, you're subject to federal arrest. Now, the court passed that as a law, too. Are you going to give credibility to that law? Are you going to tell me that the idea that your free speech rights are limited to a small, specific geographic area within a fence because a court said so? Really? They have made it very clear that if you step outside that fence or if you step off the road, and there are signs all along the highway, I mean, as close as every 50 feet in certain areas, where they're notifying you that if you step off the highway, you're subject to federal arrest and imprisonment. It's public land, ladies and gentlemen. They don't own it. We do. Didn't we just go through this with the government shutdown and World War II vets who wanted to go to the Veterans Memorial? Didn't we just go through this where they were shutting down willfully to intentionally hurt individuals and families, where they were shutting down national parks? They didn't have to shut those parks down. They chose to spend extra money to do so. Not because it was the right thing to do, not because they were short-handed. They hired extra personnel to accomplish the task. What their goal was to intentionally cause injury to the people who wanted to visit those parks. And this is no different. None whatsoever. Senator Dean Heller, he's told the U.S. Bureau of Land Management chief, whose name is Neil Corns in Washington, D.C., that these people in Nevada are law-abiding and that they should not be penalized by an overreaching federal agency. With all due respect, I've got to ask, why in Congress is no one shutting the purse strings on these agencies? We've talked about this repeatedly. There's not a federal agency, not a single one with 2 exceptions, that has the authority to exist constitutionally. There are only 2. What are they? Border Patrol, which is a recognized, constitutionally granted power authorized to the federal government, and the Commerce Department. That's it. None of these other federal agencies, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, the ATF, the FCC, the FAA, the USDA, the FTC, you can pick it, there's thousands of them. None of them have constitutional authority to exist. You want to argue the point? Let me give you the argument. We never gave Congress the power, in our limited power of attorney to them, to subdelegate that limited power of authority to other individuals who we did not elect whose names we don't know, who are unaccountable, who don't even take an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States or to faithfully execute the laws. Get it? Congress has illegally and unconstitutionally given themselves self-appointed power to subdelegate our limited power of attorney to administrative agencies, who then, for all intents and purposes, make rules and regulations that act and parade about as law, but are not. What we now have is proof in the pudding that you've got a federal agency, two in fact, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, that are 100% out of control. They have taken it upon themselves to act as a law enforcement agency. Where's the authority for that? Where is the constitutional authority for that? Where is the constitutional authority for them to limit your constitutional First Amendment right to free speech, to redress your grievances against your government? Where is their authority to take an individual into custody for stepping 1 foot to the left or 1 foot to the right? It does not exist. And you cannot pass a law. Jefferson himself, Madison, repeated the refrain over and over and over. Any law passed which violates the Constitution is null and void on its face. Null and void, and of no effect. That's not a paraphrase. That's a verbatim quote. Null and void, and of no effect. You can have 100 judges who say that the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management have the right to go take this man's cattle. It does not make them legitimate. You can have a court that deems that it's okay to commit murder, but it doesn't make it so. You can have a court that deems it illegal for you to possess or own a certain weapon, but your Second Amendment right does not say you can own any weapon as long as the government approves of it. Doesn't say you can own any weapon you like as long as you have less than 10 rounds in it. This isn't overreach, ladies and gentlemen. This is tyranny. And Dean Heller, Senator Dean Heller, should know that. Senator Harry Reid, Dirty Harry, he already knows that. You know why? Because Dirty Harry is bathed in treason and tyranny. Dirty Harry is the most corrupt senator in the nation, without a doubt. His family has gotten rich based upon his tenure as a U.S. senator. The dirty deals, that's why I call him Dirty Harry. Go look at the history of Dirty Harry. Go look it up. Go look at how his sons are all involved in real estate transactions around the state, and all of them get preferential treatment. Where's Dirty Harry on all of this? Governor Brian Sandoval, he's the Republican governor for Nevada. He pointed earlier to what he called, quote, an atmosphere of intimidation resulting from the roundup. And he says that constitutional rights of the protesters and the family are being trampled. Senator Heller said that he had received a contact from local officials and residents and the Nevada Cattlemen's Association, and his concern was, quote, extremely concerned. By the way, I hate when they say that. I'm deeply concerned. I'm extremely concerned. You know what that means? Get out of my face. I've got nothing further to say. He remains, quote, extremely concerned about the size of this closure and disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure. Really. They're taking this man's property. They've imprisoned his son. They've thrown protesters to the ground, and you're deeply and extremely concerned about the size of the closure. The closure of what? The size of the park? What kind of a fool are you? Disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure. So, are you trying to tell me, sir, that disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure override the rights of that individual? they've shut down, the Bureau of Land Management has shut down an area, literally, folks, that is the size of the state of Delaware. The size of the state of Delaware. Also that they can round up 900 cattle, which, by their own admission, will cost $3 million. Between $2 and $3 million. So you're telling me that between $2 and $3 million of taxpayer money is going to be spent to round up cattle that, I mean, look, 900 cattle, that's a lot of cattle. And to a cattleman, that's a lot of money. But you're talking about nowhere close to the, and under what auspice are they going to auction those off and then return money back to the taxpayers? Is that the game plan? Well, we don't know. But we do know that if there were backhoes that were burying cows, then there's not even a resource to sell to retain the taxpayer, to refund the taxpayers' money. They've hired cowboys to come in pickups and horses and helicopters to drive and herd the cattle. They've closed off the park so that there can be no press, no media, no public to see what they're up to. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a government which operates in secret. And a government which operates in secret means that right off the bat, they are operating outside the boundaries. I mean, the Supreme Court, again, never a final arbiter of our Constitution, has declared emphatically that you, as a citizen, have the right to film any law enforcement officer during the occurrence of their on-duty service. Because as a public enforcement officer, they are operating in the auspices of the public. You have every right to film everything they do. And yet, they've closed off an area the size of Delaware to prohibit that exact activity. This is an argument, folks, that goes far beyond a rancher and a couple of hundred cows. This is a farm, or a situation, I should say, that comes into play with a couple of different major issues. One, states' rights. Two, federal ownership of land within states, which, by the way, the Constitution itself specifically prohibits. It says that the federal government may not own anything other than the 10 square miles of Washington, D.C. That's it. They can only own a few limited forts and depots around the country. That's it, folks. That's all they own. They don't own these massive swaths of land that the Bureau of Land Management has usurped and stolen from individual states. They don't have possession of national parks. They can pass a law that says we have the right to make national parks, but it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it legal. It doesn't make them authorized. They're only authorized because we sit here silently and allow it to continue. Now, I've been calling for any individual who hears this program, who has the availability and the wherewithal to get out there, to go out there and assist. I got to tell you, if there were thousands of protesters out there instead of 100 or 150, I'll bet you they would not have thrown this woman to the ground. They would not have stood there with tasers out, tasing protesters. And to be honest with you, somebody would have gotten to the bottom of whether or not they're actually burying cattle or not. And if they are burying cattle, where's PETA? Where's PETA? Where are you? Where's the Humane Society if they are? Even if they're not, where are they to make sure that they're humanely capturing those cattle and that they're not abusing them? If those were puppy dogs, PETA and the well, perhaps not PETA. Yeah, I guess PETA would be too. I always think of them as people eating tasty animals, not. But, PETA and the Humane Society should be on this scene. Where are they? Nowhere to be found. Crickets. And to make matters worse, the governor or the government is basically doing all of this for a group of turtles that they themselves euthanized less than a year ago. Absolutely absurd. The point here is that this is not about 900 cattle. This is about control and power. This is about an agency which deems that they have the authorization, the right to abuse these individual families. They threw this woman to the ground. They sicked a canine dog on a pregnant woman. Come on. They had a bunch of dogs there. You can see in the video. They tased a protester 3 times. You could hear the thing click, 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 click. If you're out of work, if you're retired, if you have the time, if you're on vacation, get out there. Lock elbows with hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of other Americans. And let's put out a message that we are going to ring that guy's ranch and that none of you are welcome. In fact, if we have enough individuals, what we really need to do is turn the tables and arrest all 200 of them. That's the estimated number of law enforcement. By now, by the way, that number has probably shot up to twice that. Because they see that this is a conflict happening. With all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow this to become the next Waco, the next Ruby Ridge. If it does, if one innocent protester, if one member of that family is further hurt, then this should be the opening shot, fired across the bow. This should be the shot heard around the world. And with it, the United States of America should be returned to control of the people. This should be the catalyst. We're going to take a break. When we return, we're going to tackle our last 2 topics. We'll keep an eye on this, and we'll be reporting to you as we move forward. Our next subject will be the DHS and how they've kept a report of North Korea's EMP threat secret from us. Suppressed that report for years. And by the way, no one in Congress has taken any mitigating action to protect us from it. And they know it's available, and they know it's live. Our 4th topic will be Cummings and the IRS committee, and how Cummings has colluded with the IRS and Lois Lerner, and he sits on the committee that's hearing the abuse. Unbelievable. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to America's Voice Now.